Hi, what's up? I'm Channel Pup, the mascot for the level-headed fanboy, and today we're looking at a bit of a special case, a Spider-Man cartoon that is known for being unintentionally hilarious and going on to become a massive internet meme. But the true story behind it is actually a lot more tragic than I had expected. It's the story of a perfectly well-meaning cartoon which stumbled its way into existence, crawled around on the floor, whimpered, farted, and died. This is the story of Spider-Man 1967, the very first on-screen Spider-Man appearance.
Hello there, I'm Captain America, and I'm here to give you a PSA. Now, if you love your country, you'll want to subscribe to Channel Pup. If you don't love your country, well, that's just too bad. But you can still subscribe anyway. Commies welcome. And of course, actually, we'll talk about that. But of course, nothing comes free in this country, except for freedom. And no exception is the Adobe subscriptions that Channel Pup needs to make these videos. So be sure to check out the Patreon link in the description below. And God bless America.
So by this point, Spider-Man had captured the imaginations of a generation of comic book readers when he made his first appearance in the 15th and final issue of the discontinued Amazing Fantasy comic series, at a time when Marvel were struggling. Thanks to old Webhead, Marvel didn't need Amazing Fantasy anymore. Spidey would go on to star in his very own comic series, The Amazing Spider-Man, which would launch in the March of 1963, fresh from the work desk of illustrator, comic legend, and Spider-Man co-creator Steve Ditko. Like the late Stan Lee said, Ditko could frame an image like a world-class cinematographer. Not only is the composition outstanding, not only are their characters illustrated with gorgeous levels of detail, but there is just so much motion in these images. Ditko was the perfect fit for a character as realistic yet also dynamic as Spider-Man. Now sure, these are static illustrations, but with how well they're drawn, how convincing these poses are, you don't need to use a lot of imagination to see these characters in motion. Spidey's adventures were larger than life as the Webhead would face off against a rogues gallery so iconic, it could rival Batman's. But at the core of these stories was an adolescent young man. What Spider-Man was doing differently was, at this time, the teenage superhero isn't the sidekick now. He's the main character, and he's neurotic. He's a lovesick, penniless wallflower. Just like you at home, you mouth-breathing, maidenless dork. The rest is history. We recently wrapped up on my Spider-Man film retrospective earlier this year, so we know what an enduring legacy this character has, and the incredible stories that can be told with him. Stories about maturity, dreams, identity, and of course, responsibility. This is a character that has transcended the story of just one man. It's an ideology now, a philosophy. Spider-Man has traversed different genres, dimensions, film studios. His stories have taken some of the biggest gambles in the history of comics. There is so much you can do with this character. Unlike the likes of Batman and Superman, Spider-Man did not take decades to form as the character we know and love today. He hit the ground running immediately out of the gate, and 5 years into his tenure, he'd be making his very first small screen appearance in his very own show. By this point, Spider-Man had been passed from Steve Ditko to John Romita Sr., and with over 50 issues in the bag, packed to the brim with iconic stories and characters, the ABC Network, Krantz Films, and Grand Trey Lawrence Animation had a plentiful harvest to work with. So let's blow the vault doors off of their hinges and enter the world of 1967's Spider-Man. It's not great. The internet owes a lot to Spider-Man 1967, as us patrons of the online matrix have well and truly had our way with this show. Memes. That's what this show is best known for today. Memes, as this cheap and cheerful show is full of imagery that becomes absolutely hilarious when viewed out of context. Not that you'd be totally stone-faced watching it in context either. When people think of 60s Spider-Man, there are two things that spring to mind: the relentlessly catchy jingle from the opening, and the memes. Memes that have gone full circle and made their way into the franchise proper. You might have seen this image of two Spider-Men pointing at each other, and if you haven't seen that, you've certainly seen it referenced in the films, to an obnoxious extent. You can even buy a Funko Pop of it. Seems like an easy way to sell two of the same Funko Pop, but alrighty, that's capitalism for you. Well, that started here. And the iconic "does whatever a Spider-Man can" jingle? Yeah, that originated here too. So yes, this show did leave behind a legacy. Memes, and an excellent theme song. But the show itself is scarcely talked about these days. One thing most people understand is that the animation kinda sucks. And no, it wasn't just of its time. The animation sucks. It sucked then, it sucks now. It's actually worse than you probably realize. We'll get into that. For reference, Hanna-Barbera cartoons would notoriously cut corners. Anything to keep budgets down. It's what's known as limited animation, where you keep character movements to a minimum for incidental scenes, and have certain cycles and movements that would just get reused. Spider-Man would take on this technique, and take it even further. Not quite as far as Grant Trey Lawrence would a year prior with the Marvel superhero show, where they'd literally scan comic artwork and maybe move a mouth or a limb. This was, to its credit, for the most part, comprised of somewhat original artwork. There are some Ditko tracings in there, but it was at least an animated show. Just about. When I watched the first couple of episodes, I kind of thought to myself, well, the animation is clearly quite basic, but is it that bad? That was until I had about 10 episodes in the hole and noticed the overall animation structure of the show. Okay, so you got a shot here of Spider-Man traversing the sky on a single web line. You'll be seeing it a lot. He covers a huge amount of ground with just that one thread. That's like a metaphor for the animation in this show. Getting as much use out of one thing as possible. For each character, there are a few set talking poses, a few close-ups, mid-shots, and within that, all that really changes are facial expressions and mouth movements. There are also some basic walk cycles, which are pretty goofy looking, and the show relies very heavily on just this set of animation. Then for transitions between scenes, we've got these swing sets of Spider-Man. You've got him traversing the skies, you've got him swinging around a pole, and so it goes. And all they'll really do for these is swap out the backgrounds. Maybe if there's a chase going on, they'll use these swing sets and then cut between this and the enemy on the run. You can pretty much count the number of bespoke animations for each episode on one hand. Imagine being so lazy as to simply rely on a set of pre-made animations. What? I think the heavy reliance on animation reuse is what allowed the artwork to be as detailed as it is. And that's saying something as well. How to describe this show's art style? It's doing its best to kinda capture the Steve Ditko look, but in the most simplified fashion possible. A great example of this is Spider-Man himself, who really does look different from shot to shot in terms of like his eyes and head shape, etc. There is no on-model version of this Spider-Man, it just changes. But they've made slight changes to Spidey's design in order to save time and money. For one, 8 legs on a spider is just too much, so now the spider has only 6. You know, like a spider. And the webs have been completely removed from Spidey's arms and torso. I'm not gonna lie though, I thought that was an alright workaround. What's funny to me is areas where they didn't cut corners in the animation. For example, the fact they still bothered putting any webs on Spidey's costume to begin with. Given how simplified all of this is, I feel like you could have gotten away with ditching them entirely. This and the fact that Spidey still has a moving jaw when he talks. That's a corner I reckon you could also cut. Speaking of visual metaphors though, Spidey's costume is kind of the perfect metaphor for what this show just is. It's Spider-Man as you know and love him, but he's been gutted of all of his flair. As I mentioned earlier, a great deal of what separates Spider-Man from other superheroes is that he has problems that people of all ages can kind of relate to in some form. School, bullies, relationships, a clueless boss, financial struggles, an elderly loved one. And sure, every issue of the comics he'd be facing down a new foe in a larger-than-life battle in the skies of NYC. But what brought it all home was that once the mask was off and he was in his homestead, that was where the real struggles began. In Spider-Man 67, however, we don't really see any of Peter's personal life. A budding romance between him and Betty Brant is fleetingly touched upon as it looks like Peter's about to ask her out before he's interrupted by J. Jonah Jameson, sending him on some wacky mission. The dichotomy between Peter Parker and Spider-Man is broken down to one singular trait each, which the show just kinda runs with. Spider-Man will fight the villain of the week. Peter Parker is a photographer for the Daily Bugle, with the only regular cast members being Peter Parker, Betty Brant, and J. Jonah Jameson. There's a definite formula here. Spider-Man is out on patrol and spots something unusual, discovers the villain of the week, gets a picture, brings it to Jonah. Jonah doesn't initially believe it to be of any relevance to the Daily Bugle, until he gets a dozen phone calls from different citizens, and so, as though Peter didn't just suggest the idea, Jonah will send Peter in to get pictures. Peter goes in as Spider-Man to thwart the villain, may or may not forget to snap some pics, and Jonah tries to find some way to spin Spider-Man as the true culprit. Betty Brant says something nice about Spider-Man, Peter basically winks at the camera, lather, rinse, repeat. While this is an incredibly simplified and frankly reductive approach to Spider-Man stories, on its own 2 feet, it's not a terrible setup for a show. By this point, Spider-Man comics were absolutely soaring past this standard of character and story though. So, snap back to reality, it's an incredibly low-budget show. Not only is the animation barely existent, but the majority of the story is communicated through dialogue. Now, admittedly, even some of the best comics out there are no stranger to over-explanatory dialogue, but Spider-Man 67 abides by a strict tell because we can't afford to show philosophy. Neither Marvel or ABC would sink anywhere near enough money into this show to truly do Spidey justice. In terms of characterization, there's very little here to speak of. Peter Parker is, a guy, a nice enough fella, I guess. That's about it, really. I mean, okay, I guess he's presumably smart given that he cooks up a new type of webbing every other episode tailor-made to thwart a specific foe, but that's really all there is to Peter Parker. Then when he's Spider-Man, he's got that cheeky Spidey sense of humor, and he occasionally breaks the fourth wall to talk to the audience. At least, I think that's what's happening. I mean, he's facing the camera and there's nobody else here, so surely, right? Betty Brant is nice, I guess. She has a positive view of Spider-Man and often asserts that to J. Jonah Jameson, not afraid to stand up to her boss. Jameson is probably the most well-fleshed out character in the show. He's hot-headed, laps up any credit he can get, wants to be recognized by the public as a hero, and while he consistently grumbles about teenagers, the 2 people he works with are both teenagers, which leads me to believe that he's a reluctant progressive. Dude also has a weird amount of civic responsibility, as he'll often work alongside the police. In one instance, he was expected to fork out millions of dollars to Sandman in order to restore a valuable diamond to its home. At the same time, Jameson has no qualms about endangering his teenage freelance photographer Peter Parker, as he sends him in his place to meet the Sandman over said diamond. In terms of the acting, Paul Kligman does a great job as J. Jonah Jameson, laying down the blueprint for how Jameson sounds in a way that his successors have clearly taken heed. Monique Miller did a great job as Betty Brant, and then we have Peter himself, voiced by Paul Soles. Now, Paul Soles by no means turns in a bad performance. I'm just not sold on him as a teenager. Spider-Man sounds like a private eye in his 40s. One thing he does that's kinda cool though, especially given that this would be the first time we'd ever hear Spidey talk, is that Paul Soles would change up his voice when he's Peter Parker and when he's Spider-Man, with Spider-Man sounding a lot more brash and heroic than his softer-spoken Peter voice. I'll also say this, he handles Spidey's wit well. Not in a way that we're necessarily accustomed to, mind you. His delivery is so incredibly dry that Spidey's wit just feels that much more effortless and cheeky. The dry delivery, paired with the cheeky sense of humor, makes Paul Soles' Spider-Man just fun to listen to. But of course, what would Spidey be without his iconic villains? The first season definitely delivers on the villain front, as Spidey faces off against Dr. Octopus, Green Goblin, Mysterio, Sandman, Electro, Lizard, Smythe, Rhino, and Vulture Man. He's just referred to as Vulture Man in this for some reason. Like everything else in this show, they're all highly simplified versions. We don't get to witness the origins of Dr. Octopus, nor does he even leave a fraction of the impact on Spidey that Ock of the comics did. With the Lizard, rather than Dr. Connors trying to regrow his arm, he instead became the Lizard while trying to create a cure for jungle fever. My guess is that with the strict requirements of children's TV back in the 60s, it'd be considered a bit too morbid for Dr. Connors to be a man whose arm popped off. Amputee, that was the word I was looking for. The villain who suffers the most from this oversimplification is the Green Goblin. At this time in Spidey history, Green Goblin had already been revealed as Norman Osborn, leading to some incredible stories, as Goblin knows Peter's true identity and torments him. Now admittedly, this took place in Amazing Spider-Man 39, which would release in 1966, a year before the air date of Spider-Man 67. It's hard to gauge exactly how long the production cycle for Spider-Man 67 would have been, especially as this entire process would have been significantly slower in the 60s, even with the limited animation style. So had production began before that, then they would have significantly less to work with regarding Gobby. That said, even prior to issue 39, Green Goblin was a far more interesting character than his 67 cartoon counterpart, as he'd seek to dominate the criminal underworld, and his true identity was presented as an ongoing mystery for readers. With Spider-Man 67's take on the character, we get none of that. Green Goblin is probably just a dude, maybe a legitimate goblin, who knows, that will go to a mansion hideout, try to learn magic, and then go use his new occult power on Spider-Man. And that's it. This version of the character is genuinely pathetic. I won't lie though, I thought Mysterio was done well enough on this show. Mysterio makes his appearance in a double-length episode that closely adapts the events of Amazing Spider-Man 13, albeit with all of Peter's personal life aspects stripped out. Now a funny detail here though is, I don't know how intentional this was back in the day, but Quentin Beck in the Ditko Spider-Man comics always bore a striking resemblance to Leonard Nimoy. And of course, in 1965, Leonard Nimoy would go on to play the Vulcan Mr. Spock in the original Star Trek series. Now, Vulcans had these pointy elf ears. It's a distinctive part of Spock's design. Now take a look at Quentin Beck in Spider-Man 67 with inexplicable elf ears, making the inspiration pretty undeniable at this point. There were a number of episodes just like the Mysterio episode, which pulled their stories from the comics, and while there's certainly a novelty that comes with adapting existing material, Spider-Man 67 is simplified to the point of redundancy. Why would I watch these cartoons when I could read the comics, which feature excellent character exploration and world building that made these comics so gripping to begin with? Okay, I guess you could say with Spider-Man 67, there's movement. You get to see him move. Okay, well this will probably sound a little ridiculous, but I'm sure there was more movement in the comic pages than there is in this cartoon. Let me explain. The comics are full of bespoke artwork. There's no reuse or recycling here that I'm aware of, and every panel is wonderfully composed. There is movement in these images. Now look at the show. It's stiff and it's static. Oh, okay, you want literal movement? Fine, I'll move this comic page around the screen. There, it's moving. There's about as much movement going on here as there is in the show. Peter Parker and his alter ego Spider-Man are here alongside Betty Brant, but it doesn't matter because the two barely interact. The two are barely shown to have lives of their own. The villains are here, but none of it matters because again, they don't feel like people. Heck, the show is set in New York City, but the place is barren and empty, and half the time the confrontations take place in just a room or a cave or something. I suppose the best thing about this is those cartoon sound effects. Nothing here can be taken seriously with those cartoony sound effects. Anytime someone lands a punch, you just got that cartoon bonk sound, and it's just really funny. So what's the point of any of this? What does Spider-Man 67 actually have to offer? Well, due to licensing costs and a low budget, Spider-Man 67 couldn't have a classic Spider-Man villain for every episode. And so, Spidey's Rose Gallery gets a bit of an expansion in this world. Like the classic villains in this show, these aren't really characters so much as they are mustache-twirling gimmicks, but this does at least offer something new that you wouldn't find in the comics. More or less. The second episode in, and already Spider-Man 67 gives us a taste of its more original ideas, with Spidey investigating New York City freezing over, alongside another original recurring character, Dr. Smarter. The two discover that the source of the freezing is aliens from the planet Pluto, just trying to get home. Yeah, that's the story. Other examples of original villains include Dr. Noah Body, a man who created a device that can turn him invisible and has beef with J. Jonah Jameson. The Metal-Eating Monster, a giant growing robot who eats all of the metal in NYC. Where did he come from? Who made him? It's never stated. He came to this world and he was thwarted by Spider-Man, so we move. Parafino, a man who creates wax models and brings them to life. Which is actually not a terrible idea. Admittedly, I think a little workshopping and Parafino could become a very interesting villain. The Fifth Avenue Phantom. He uses technology to commit crimes, including robots and machinery that can create living shadows. Definitely feels more like Mysterio's rubbish cousin or something. Charles Cameo is a master of disguise who impersonates the Prime Minister. And that could have just been the Chameleon. Dr. Von Schlick, a criminal scientist who seeks to transform NYC's oil into an element to help him conquer the universe. Dr. Magneto, a scientist snubbed by the New York Hall of Science who created a gun that can control magnetism in order to get revenge on the Hall of Science. The Fly Twins, Stan and Lee. Oh, now that's cute. Kinda makes sense to have Spider-Man take on some actual fly-themed baddies now that I think about it, and I like that their costumes aren't a million miles away from Spidey's. In fact, they kind of remind me of big-time Spider-Man. There are enough original villains here to fill up a roster, and admittedly, not all of them are terrible ideas. I think Parafino and the Fly Twins are definitely the standouts as far as original villains go, but with that said, these aren't really characters so much as they are concepts. The gimmick comes first. And that's partly because this show just has no time to explore any of that, filling in just a 10-minute slot. Spider-Man Season 1 is perfectly fit to entertain a child. It consists of juvenile and simple Spidey capers that are just entertaining enough to keep a child's attention, it's just poor quality enough to ironically entertain an adult, and it retains just enough iconography and imagery to engage a fan of the character for a bit. It lacks the intensity, the style, the action, the violence, and the drama of its comic counterpart, and it doesn't really add enough to justify choosing it over the comics, aside from a handful of original villains, most of which are pretty terrible. It serves as a vessel of low-end 1960s superhero entertainment from an era when Marvel and Krantz just weren't giving these shows enough funding, so the priority was just getting the product out of the door, rather than telling a great story, which is especially unfortunate when you consider that 2 decades prior, we had the Fleischer Brothers Superman cartoons, which were gorgeously animated, charming Superman tales that managed to achieve a lot in a limited space of time. Spider-Man 67 does have its charm and can be enjoyed as a product of its time, and it no doubt helped to propel Spidey into the cultural icon that he is today, but as far as Spidey's on-screen appearances go, Spidey deserved better. Even at the time, the Spidey comics were leaps and bounds better than this show. But I'm only talking about Season 1 here right now, and this is what most people will already know about. Season 1 is where most of the memes originate, and it's the most talked about part of the show. But when Season 1 bowed out, so did the animation studio behind it, with Grand Trey Lawrence Animation now bankrupt. And so, for Season 2, Spider-Man would be produced in-house at Krantz Films, with Ralph Bakshi taking on the role as the executive producer and showrunner. Now, you might have heard of Ralph Bakshi before, as he's quite a legend in the animation world. Hailed today as the godfather of adult animation, Ralph Bakshi is known for such films as Fritz the Cat and Cool World. A believer in the notion that animation is not just for kids, and whatever you might think of his work, it can't be denied that he's a trailblazer that paved the way for animated shows like South Park and Family Guy. Making this all possible was a job he took on in his 20s as an avid fan of the character of Spider-Man. So Spider-Man Season 2 would take on a different direction. Episodes would now run at 20 minutes as opposed to 10 like in Season 1. We'd explore a little more of Peter's personal life outside of his Spider-Man persona, including Spider-Man's origin story. Now that all sounds like a massive and necessary improvement. Spider-Man and his villains require more than just a 10-minute slot to really explore, so there was far more potential for Season 2. Maybe this time we could actually explore the character of Norman Osborn, meet Liz Allen, Flash Thompson, maybe Gwen and MJ. We could humanize the villains a bit more, give them motivations just beyond, wanting to commit crimes and dominate the world. Well, it starts off rather promising with its opening episode, The Origin of Spider-Man, which is a very faithful retelling of Spider-Man's origin story, drawing very apparent inspiration not only from Amazing Fantasy 15, but also Spectacular Spider-Man Magazine Issue 1, where much of the dialogue is directly pulled from. Gotta wonder if the original writer was paid for that. The Origin of Spider-Man is generally considered by most Spidey historians as the best episode of the show, and I can definitely see why. In this episode, we finally see some of Peter's high school and home life with Uncle Ben and Aunt May. Then Season 2's second episode, Kingpin, is also pretty solid, with Kingpin running a fake medication operation and Jameson refusing to halt the Daily Bugle's investigation into it. This is also the episode where Peter joins the Daily Bugle, and we get some interesting character development from JJ. So for one, Jameson refuses to halt the Bugle's report on Kingpin's crimes and outright stands up to Kingpin when face to face, making him one tenacious newspaper editor. But also, Jameson hires Peter over the phone with no interview or questioning, all because he's aware his uncle died and he wants to do a good deed. Peter also gets his job for the Daily Bugle and drops out of college to provide for Aunt May. It's a little context that goes a long way. The lives of these characters matter so much more when you actually get to see the lives of these characters. While Kingpin has some solid moments and a decent plot, a major issue with Season 2 crept in here. Pacing. So as I said, Season 2 episodes are 20 minutes as opposed to 10. But that additional time isn't exactly packed with intense action or drama, no. While there is definitely more drama than there was in Season 1, it's ultimately breadcrumbs compared to what takes up the majority of this runtime. Web swinging. I thought I'd never get tired of seeing Spider-Man web swinging. I got tired of seeing Spider-Man web swinging. What used to be just quick transitionary shots are now scenes in of themselves. In the episode Kingpin, there's a 2-minute stretch of Spider-Man just web swinging, before cutting to two New Yorkers talking about Spider-Man, before cutting back for more of Spider-Man web swinging. There's gotta be over 5 minutes of this here, and there's only 30 seconds worth of actual footage of Spider-Man web swinging, that's an estimate, to go around. Fun drinking game. Watch Kingpin and count how many times Spider-Man webs around this pole. You'll be rat-arsed. If it's not constant web-swinging reuse, it's an abundance of constant establishing shots, many of which repeated. And if there's a moving car, you'll show the car. You'll show the car's pedals. You'll show the wheels. You'll show the car some more. Maybe the headlamps. Hurry up, damn it! Show the rest of the episode! Despite a stronger start, I honestly think Season 2 is worse than Season 1. For one, there are the aforementioned pacing issues. Ralph Bakshi would even go on to state that there were times when they just couldn't make the 20-minute time slot, so he'd just cram in a few minutes of extra web swinging. But a bigger issue for me personally is that classic Spider-Man villains are completely absent for Season 2, with the exception of Kingpin in the second episode, and the robber who killed Uncle Ben in the opening, that is, if you count him. In terms of villains this time, it's a less memorable serving, and I mean that in reference to strictly just original villains. I'm not comparing these to the legacy players. No, these guys don't even stack up when pitted against the likes of Parafino. Just a lot of green fellas here. Pardo Presents has a cool giant black cat, I guess. And no, not that black cat. But the cat is more interesting than Pardo himself. There's a bank robber who disguises himself as the leader of an underground society and convinces the people of the underground society that the surface world are stealing their gold and silver. And so, with that, the underpeople help him rob banks. Just an ordinary day in NYC. The episode Home has a cool concept with the character of Carol, who's a lady that seems attracted to Peter at a nightclub. But she's actually a criminal with spider powers of her own, marking the first time Peter has had to wrangle with someone with his own power. In fact, Carol has multiple henchmen, all with their own spider powers. What an intriguing setup. Turns out she's just an alien, and she just wants to get home. Bit like the Plutonians from episode 2. Just what is this anymore? In essence, the show in some ways feels more faithful to the comics than the first season did, in that Spider-Man is a bit more contextualized by showing more of Peter's life outside the mask. It's breadcrumbs, but it does make Spidey himself a bit more compelling. But the whole point is that it should contextualize the Spidey Capers. And the Spidey Capers just don't feel like Spidey Capers, feeling more like Spider-Man has just been chucked into a copy of Strange Tales or Forbidden Worlds. I guess when you look at it in other ways, taking it down this direction could be viewed as an homage to the other works of Spidey's co-creator Steve Ditko. But this is Spider-Man. Aliens? Underground civilizations? What is this? These would be okay for occasional filler. Heck, some of these would make really interesting one-off detour episodes. But an entire season of just this? It's also made worse by the fact that Season 2 of Spider-Man would borrow a lot of animation assets from Rocket Robin Hood, which was a space opera reimagining of Robin Hood from Ralph Bakshi and Krantz films. There was a reason for this. Season 2's budget was slashed even further, with Bakshi recounting a budget of $12,000 and a week to complete each episode, which probably sounds unthinkable for any professional animator. Most of the time and budget was spent on the opening 2 episodes, which makes sense, as they are the better of the crop. So, with the reduced budget, they clearly decided against licensing Spidey's Rogues Gallery beyond just Kingpin. So there's your classic villain episode. And to save time and budget on new villains, many characters were just lifted from Rocket Robin Hood. It was a means to an end in a pretty unthinkable working condition. There are a few interesting artistic changes in Season 2 as well. This time, for the most part, Spidey's costume manages to retain all 8 of the spider's legs. So, that's a plus. And there are some genuinely kinda cool bespoke shots in there, mostly in the opening episode. Given the more otherworldly environments, the backgrounds are generally a lot more interesting to look at this time, even if much of which are pulled from Rocket Robin Hood. But also these worlds are a bit more populated, with more characters on screen at a time. Then there's the skies, which are just interesting. I like the idea of psychedelic skies, and I think it's a cool aesthetic. But what does it add to Spider-Man? It feels like a desperate attempt to give NYC an atmosphere in this show. But NYC just isn't characterized at all. What's up with these green and red skies? Is NYC a hellhole or something? See, I'm in the minority, but I prefer the basic bitch blue skies of Season 1. Spider-Man Season 2 has its areas of improvement over the original. But on a whole, I much prefer Season 1. Shorter episodes, better pacing, less of a time commitment, and classic Spider-Man villains. I definitely think a 20-minute runtime allows for more character exploration, but when you're barely doing that, it's better to just revert to the 10-minute slots. And no classic Spider-Man villains, come on. Okay, but for a more positive spin, Season 2 can be easily viewed as experimental. And if you're a fan of pulpy sci-fi comics from the 1960s, maybe Season 2 has something to offer you. It's kind of nuts to me how both Season 1 and 2 managed to betray so much of what makes Spider-Man great in different ways. I guess you could say Season 1 neglects Peter Parker, and Season 2 neglects the world of Spider-Man. Also, just a bit of info I want you to keep in your pocket, alright? Captain Stacy makes an appearance in the final episode of Season 2, and he looks like this, alright? Just memorize that, okay? Season 2 was not the end of Spider-Man 67. There was a third and final season. The best thing I can say about this one is that the classic villains are back, but at a cost. I'm not going to try and big this one up or allude to the possibility of this being an improvement. Season 3 is just the worst of the bunch, out of the gate. It's critical at this point. Just look at it. Look at it. It's dying. It is immolating. It is weeping. So budgets were cut even further for Season 3, because to hell with investing in a great product that everyone will want to tune into. But the budget was already critically low for Season 2. Heck, Season 1. So Season 3 has to do the unthinkable. While there are a handful of original episodes here, they're nothing noteworthy. There's the episode with the giant killer snowman, which may be worth popping in the holidays as a bit of trite entertainment. And Mysterio gets a new episode. The story borrows heavy cues from Amazing Spider-Man 67, with Mysterio trapping a miniaturized Spider-Man in a theme park of his own design. That's kinda cool, and I'm glad that they're back to the comic adaptations, redundant as they are. But just one little question here. What the hell did they do to Mysterio? Who is this? I can deal with a turtleneck, but removing the fishbowl was a step too far. We also got another notable character introduction, with Mary Jane working as a show dancer for the Kingpin's Club. Interestingly, however, she was the niece of Captain Stacy, making her kind of a mashup between Gwen Stacy and Mary Jane. Interesting. But also, Mysterio wasn't the only guy to get a redesign because, hi, who's this? Why, it's Captain Ned Stacy, of course. Almost didn't recognize you there. A little inconsistent, isn't it? Well, Captain Stacy would return for a third and final time, and you know how this show reuses animation. What if I told you that they reused both versions of Captain Stacy in one episode? Jesus Christ, you can't make it up. Season 3's episode count was cut down to 13 episodes, a few of which back in the 10-minute runtime, and a good chunk of these are just tweaked versions of existing episodes. Take the 2 opening episodes, for example. The Winged Thing, featuring the Vulture, is almost the same as The Sky is Falling from Season 1, even down to more granular details. But the episode that follows is even more egregious. Remember Where Crawls the Lizard from Season 1? The episode that featured Spidey headed to Florida to track down and cure the lizard? Well, Season 3's episode, Connor's Reptiles, is almost the exact same. Except here, rather than being the lizard, Connors creates the lizard, a separate entity from himself. The episode is near identical, except when Spider-Man cures the lizard, rather than revealing Dr. Connors, we instead fade to black and the lizard just vanished with a quick line of dialogue to explain where he's gone. That's a new episode, right? Hope you're enjoying that. Looking forward to a new one? Well, there's your new episode. That's what a good chunk of this season is. Season 1 episodes with new backgrounds and dialogue. What a horrible state to see the show in. Thrashing around on the floor, clawing at bits of itself to try to present as new. And then dare we even talk about the most controversial episode in the series' history. Revolt in the Fifth Dimension. An episode that ABC refused to air and would not be shown until the show was picked up in syndication. Now there's a good reason why ABC would not want to air this. There is also the reason ABC didn't want to air this. So the reason they didn't want to air it is because it contained a lot of very psychedelic imagery. And while, you know, it's the Spider-Man 67, there's not a lot of movement in any of these images, there's a lot of flash cuts to all these different psychedelic images, psychedelic scenery, you got swirls and spirals, you got Spider-Man in interesting lighting situations, some shots that admittedly kind of go a little hard. And yeah, ABC were worried that it would prove too disturbing for the kids at home. Honestly, I would love to just pop in a D8 gummy, sit down, and see how I fare up watching this episode, but then there's the good reason why they wouldn't want to show it, but I don't think that's the reason they didn't want to show it, given that they didn't seem to have any qualms about doing this earlier. It's another repackaged existing episode, but this time it's not Spider-Man. This time, they have taken an entire Rocket Robin Hood episode and just swapped Robin Hood out with Spider-Man. And there's around 10 or so minutes of this episode where Spider-Man is completely absent, so it is just 10 or so minutes of that Rocket Robin Hood episode. God, just the... It's fascinating, honestly. Like, it's a very fascinating turn of events. And it makes for a very fascinating TV show and mashup and crossover, actually. Oh, this poor show. The finale of the show, A Trip to Tomorrow, sees Spider-Man landing in a boxcar of a moving train, where he meets a child running away from home, and there he recounts his adventures to inspire the child into a life of heroism. It's a clip show. Everybody loves a clip show, right? They just love it when you're clamoring for that new episode and you get stuff you've already seen before. Just love it. In all honest truth, I don't know exactly who to blame for Spider-Man 67's downfall. It wasn't Bakshi's fault, as he was working with what he had, round the clock 7 days a week with no assistance from Marvel. Bakshi would go on to say that while he took on the job as a Spider-Man fan, Following the end of Spider-Man 67, he'd never read or watch a piece of Spider-Man media ever again. Now let's sit together, let's huddle. Let's think about that together real quick. Spider-Man, if you're here, you probably love Spider-Man just as much as I do. His stories, his world aren't just fictional stories, they've taught us things, ideals, philosophies, quotes that we bring into our everyday lives, maybe without even realizing it at times. I can't imagine what my life would have been without the influence of Spider-Man growing up. Now imagine working on Spider-Man and being so mistreated, so alienated, so disillusioned that you couldn't consume a piece of Spider-Man media ever again. I don't think I could recognize the person I'd be. Spider-Man 67 didn't exactly start strong. It didn't exactly get better. And it ended on the whimper to end all whimpers. However, a legacy was left behind, most notably in the form of the iconic theme song by J. Robert Harris and Paul Francis Webster, which will usually be the first thing that springs to mind when people think of Spider-Man's theme. It's been utilized and remixed in video games, it played over the credits of Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 1, was referenced in Spider-Man 2 and 3, was Spidey's ringtone in Amazing Spider-Man 2, was orchestrated by Mike Giacchino for the opening of Spider-Man Homecoming, and was referenced in both Into and Across the Spider-Verse, where 1967 Spider-Man made cameos. But that's not all. In 2014's Spider-Verse event, 67 Spider-Man was a part of the lineup, with Miles Morales and Peter Parker of the Ultimate Animated Spider-Man universe headed to Earth 67. It was pretty cool to have the quintessential modern Spider-Man, the most current animated iteration at the time of Spider-Man, meeting with the very first animated adaptation of the character in all of his dated glory. There's a moment where Miles unmasks in front of 67, and 67 is in disbelief because Miles is a high schooler. Actually, come to think of it, did we see any black people in Spider-Man 67? It was a different time, I guess, when green people were in vogue. The story generally revolves around Ultimate Spidey learning to take 67 Spidey seriously, as a true blue Spidey. And I honestly quite like that. It's a nice pushback against the negative reputation 67 Spidey has. With all that being said though, the reputation is by no means unfounded. The show was kind of a joke. I'm sorry, but it was. And it just didn't have the funding it needed to, function. But as fun as it is now, to sit here in my room in 2023, full of collectibles from the various different Spider-Man films and comic runs, looking at Spider-Man 67 in a vacuum, this show and what happened to it was nothing short of tragic. It was a show that had potential, and there were people working on it that genuinely wanted to make something good. And it lives on today as the butt of Spider-Man jokes on the internet, even to the extent of making it to the films. Yet the show isn't readily available for anyone to watch today. Disney owned the rights to this cartoon, yet it's nowhere to be found on Disney+. Now why is that? It might not be good, but it's a part of Spidey's history, and I think it should be made readily available. But until then, it's available on Internet Archive, which I've no doubt is a better, more reliable, more well-curated service than Disney+. As a part of Spidey history, Spider-Man 67 matters. And I mean, for Pete's sake, it was the first part of an enduring on-screen legacy for one of the most beloved characters of all time. So I'm hoping Disney, Marvel, and Sony will give some consideration to old 67 Webhead. Put his adventures on Disney+. Maybe get a Marvel Legends action figure of him out there. There's a Funko Pop of the two Spideys pointing at each other, but Spider-Man 67 branding is nowhere to be found. There's no need to fear this show anymore. It's hurting no one. To tell you the truth, when I went into this retrospective, when I went on this journey to the fifth dimension, when I went on this journey to watch all of the 1967 Spider-Man shows again, I went in hoping to have fun, to get some chuckles out of it, to be entertained, and the first season, it wore off on me, but it generally succeeded at that. But by the time we got to season 2 and then it progressed to season 3, I just started to feel sad. Because that's what this was in the end, just a really sad turn of events. Ah, man. Here's to you, 67 Spidey. You paved the way for Spidey on screen. And so the legacy continues, as next time we'll be looking at the CBS Spider-Man of 1977 as portrayed by Nicholas Hammond, Spider-Man's live-action debut. So what do you guys think? What do you guys think of Spider-Man 1967? What do you think of my retrospective? Comment below, discuss, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, you want to see more like it, be sure to hit subscribe, hit the like button. In the description below is a link to my Patreon, where for as little as $1 a month, you can get your name in the credits of these videos. And now for a special shout out to the patrons in the $10 or above tier, who are Sharif, Dare Denny, Cale Bennett, That Jordo, King K, Legendary Ray Ray, Dr. SP here. During this time of year, many Americans get angry at the sky and try to blow it up. We know what it did. You need to change update that, Dr. SP. Come on, man. You're slacking off. Sorgio, Saurus the Skeptic. Did you know the skin on your elbow is called a weenus? And for the patrons in the $5 tier, we have SSS06, Dazzle Fizzle, and Council of Geeks. Thank you so much for your generosity, patrons. But as for the rest of you at home watching today, thank you so much for watching, and have a great day. You may leave.